Hey everyone, in this video I want to break down the different ways that we can react to foods. Now, if you struggle with chronic gut issues, this is obviously a really challenging, frustrating, sometimes very stressful, sometimes quite anxiety-inducing situation to be in, especially when you can't understand and fully get under control those sorts of reactions and symptoms. So I'm hoping this video is going to be helpful in giving people a bit of a roadmap in regards to the different ways that we can react to foods. And as a result, help them maybe pinpoint with a little bit more clarity what type of food reaction they might be having, what the options are in regards to are there any tests that can help confirm these things, or do we need to go more with a food elimination diet as a way to evaluate symptoms and whether we improve on that specific elimination diet. So I'm going to lean on a paper that got published in 2020 that did a great job of breaking down 8 different categories of adverse food reaction. And you can see in this visual that initially they break it down into immune reactions and non-immune reactions. So this is obviously whereby when you're having a reaction to a food, is the immune system involved or is it not involved? Now, if we go back to this visual, you can see when the immune system is involved in this paper, they're talking about IgE mediated, non-IgE mediated, and a route whereby essentially both these things are at play. So it's a mixed type ultimately. Now, your IgE is an antibody. It's something that is produced by certain immune cells. And an IgE-mediated reaction is really your textbook allergy. I always give the example of the scene in Hitch, where Will Smith stars. And he's in one scene in the fish restaurant on a date, and in the next scene he's in the pharmacy looking for an antihistamine, and his ear, his eyelids, his lip are totally swollen, and that is your textbook allergic response. Now, this is somewhat easy to pin down because an allergic response is going to be instantaneous. So you'll be still eating the food and you might be starting to experience symptoms. There are also classic allergic symptoms: redness, swelling, itchiness, respiratory symptoms are really kind of textbook symptoms of an IgE-mediated response. A non-IgE mediated response, as you can see, examples of this can be a food protein induced enteropathy, or what they call proctocolitis, or food protein induced enterocolitis. This is inflammation, a food reaction to protein molecules that isn't dependent on this IgE response and therefore isn't going to be flagged in an IgE test that you can do to explore whether you have allergies to certain foods. Now, I've never come across this in clinic, so I don't have experience with a non-IgE mediated adverse food reaction, and I don't feel, therefore, that it's a very common situation. What is by far the most common are sensitivities and intolerances, and you can see that really these non-immune reactions in the brackets are often really food intolerances. And it's worth just distinguishing between these 3 terms because they're so frequently discussed: allergies, sensitivities, and intolerances. So we've discussed already how allergies, which can be IgE or non-IgE based, are immune responses to foods. Sensitivities are also an immune response to foods. So most of us have come across this concept of food sensitivities. A lot of us will be aware that there are food sensitivity tests out there that are looking at IgG responses to foods. So IgG is just another type of product from certain immune cells. You can look at IgG responses to food like you can look at IgE responses to food. And the idea is that if you have an excessive response, if you have higher levels than normal in regards to IgG levels, then you may have a food sensitivity. The problem with this is any food that you consume a lot of, you are going to have higher levels of IgG for. And therefore you can get false positive results in food sensitivity testing. This is perhaps the main reason why people criticize food sensitivity testing and say that it's a waste of money. The argument against that, however, is that we do have randomized controlled trials, so gold standard evidence, showing us that in certain conditions, including migraines and inflammatory bowel disease, food sensitivity testing has been shown to be very helpful. So my stance on food sensitivity testing is it does have value in specific clinical contexts. The main thing to understand is that allergies and sensitivities are both immune-mediated reactions, and we can look at IgE and IgG in bloods. Intolerances are not an immune-mediated response. And you can see in this visual again that there are different types of intolerance ultimately. We have metabolic, we have pharmacologic, there are toxic, and then an idiopathic category, which is ultimately, I would argue, a category where we just don't really have much research and fully understand what's going on there, and one day probably will. Now, if we start with metabolic examples are lactose intolerance, something that is incredibly common, but also pancreatic exocrine enzyme deficiency and FODMAP intolerance. These are three things that anyone struggling with IBS, SIBO type issues really needs to be aware of, and likely will be aware of at least lactose intolerance and FODMAP intolerance. So lactose is obviously the sugar found in dairy and things like milk. And lactose intolerance is where you're lacking the lactase enzyme to digest the lactose. In that situation, when you consume lactose, the lactose isn't getting digested in the small intestine. It's entering the large intestine, where the trillions of bacteria that you have there are going to ferment the lactose, and that produces metabolic byproducts, including short-chain fatty acids, hydrogen gas, which contribute to the symptoms of lactose intolerance, which can be bloating, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. That's fairly easy to pinpoint. You can remove lactose from the diet for 30 days and see whether symptoms improve. You can reintroduce lactose to see if symptoms come back. You can also supplement the enzyme lactase to see whether that helps you digest the lactose in your diet as well. So that's a fairly obvious way of understanding whether someone has lactose issues. The research shows us that it is very common in people with irritable bowel syndrome. There's lots of research using the lactose breath test to investigate this. Now, FODMAP intolerance obviously is very well known. This is very common in people with things like SIBO and IBS, whereby they aren't breaking down and digesting rapidly fermentable carbohydrates found in foods like onions and garlic and asparagus and leeks, among others. Now, I do want to just touch on pancreatic exocrine enzyme deficiency as well. This can be sort of confirmed via stool testing. So the GP will sometimes run this, for example, if you're working with a nutritional therapist, they will also often run this within a stool test that they run. When this comes back low, it is telling us that you are not producing enough digestive enzymes from the pancreas, and that might explain some of the gastrointestinal symptoms that you're experiencing. Now, that's going to be very broad. If you have pancreatic exocrine insufficiency, then ultimately you are not going to be digesting any of your macronutrients very well. It's not just going to be carbohydrates and those prebiotic fibers, it is going to also be fats and proteins to some degree as well. Now, I want to touch on histamine because this is also very common in those struggling with irritable bowel syndrome. Histamine is produced by certain bacteria. We consume it in certain foods, things like fermented produce, aged cheese, aged meat, leftovers. So if you're heating up a leftover dinner, let's say something like shepherd's pie, but really it could be anything, then you're increasing the risk of having a higher intake of histamine. We have enzymes that break histamine down. We have DAO, which is primarily found in the intestines and the kidney. And we have HNMT, which is found more systemically. These two enzymes have a big role to play within metabolizing the histamine that we're consuming, that is being produced by bacteria, but also histamine that is being released by various immune cells, including mast cells and basophils. So histamine is released as part of the allergic response. Histamine is actually what gives or contributes to the symptoms we associate with allergy: redness, itching, swelling. So it can be sometimes hard to differentiate between an allergy and histamine intolerance, or potentially even mast cell activation syndrome. But histamine has been shown to be strongly associated with IBS, in that if you have IBS and you go and take a over-the-counter antihistamine, some people's gut symptoms disappear. We also have a level of evidence showing us that in a subset of people with IBS, mast cells, these are one of the immune cells that release histamine, migrate to the gut lining. So there's a subset of people with IBS who have an elevated number of these mast cells in the gut wall, which seems to associate with histamine in the gut and histamine intolerance. And this might be one of the reasons why an over-the-counter antihistamine can actually be very helpful for some people diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. The million-dollar question is, why do you have some histamine issue? It can be related to maybe a low-level allergy that you have to a food, which is kind of low level enough that you haven't been able to actually pinpoint that food is a trigger of your symptoms. It could be that you have an overgrowth of bacteria in your gut that produce histamine, for example, Klebsiella species. It could be that you have some kind of environmental toxic exposure. We know that mercury, for example, as well as mycotoxins from molds that might be present in your building if there's been some level of water damage, can also trigger mast cells to release their histamine alongside other pro-inflammatory metabolites or products. Histamine intolerance, I think, is incredibly common in gut issues and is well worth exploring further. There is no accurate histamine test. I wouldn't waste your money or invest your money, spend your money on those tests. You could consider something like a microbiome test to see if you do have a bacterial overgrowth contributing to higher histamine levels, and you can just do a low histamine diet and take an over-the-counter antihistamine to see whether symptoms improve. There are natural antihistamines like quercetin, luteolin, and vitamin C that can also be utilized, and they could be used alongside an over-the-counter antihistamine, really to sort of throw the kitchen sink at it to see whether you do have a histamine issue. Finally, I want to talk about oxalates. Now, oxalates aren't on this visual, but I guess they would be categorized under the idiopathic sort of category. And actually, a paper was published last year, and I'm going to do a separate video on oxalates because I think it deserves more airtime ultimately. But there is something that I want to share from the paper, and that is this visual. And this visual shows us that there are certain species of bacteria that help break down oxalates from our diet. Oxalates are found in things like spinach, they're found in things like beetroot, it's found in cocoa, so things like dark chocolate. And there's a small percentage of people that genuinely do have an oxalate issue. Oxalates can accumulate and contribute to kidney stones, for example. But when we have a healthy microbiome, when we have healthy amounts of oxalobacter, when we have healthy amounts of bifidobacteria, when we have healthy levels of lactobacillus, when we have healthy levels of E. coli, these are all bacteria that contain the enzyme to help break down oxalates in our diet. And therefore, we should be able to tolerate normal levels of these sorts of foods like spinach and beetroot, etc., that do come with health benefits. I would encourage the vast majority of us not to fall into the trap of thinking that oxalic acid or oxalates are an anti-nutrient and that we need to be avoiding those plants for good health. That is not based on good science at this point in time. And as I've already said, just to make sure I'm giving a somewhat balanced view, I have said that there are a small percentage of people that absolutely do find symptom relief in reducing or avoiding oxalate foods in the short term. But I think the question then has to become why. Now, yeast, such as Candida albicans, produces oxalic acids, or indirectly produces oxalic acids. And the laboratory Great Plains, that are now called Mosaic Diagnostics, based in the USA, in their sort of practitioner education webinars, have sort of concluded that when you do have elevated oxalic acid in a urine test, it is more common for that to be caused by a fungal overgrowth rather than from a dietary perspective. And I think that's really important for us to appreciate. So if you do have an oxalate issue, we want to be thinking about the health of your microbiome, and we want to be thinking about whether there could be some fungal overgrowth contributing to a high burden of oxalic acid that could be contributing or increasing your risk of developing kidney stones, for example. The vast majority of us do not need to be worrying about oxalates in our food, however. And I think that really covers it for this video, guys. Those are the 8 different categories of foods of food reaction. The one I haven't mentioned is sort of the toxic category. This is fairly self-explanatory. If you look at the visual, the examples of food poisoning and scrambroid fish poisoning, you are going to know if you've had food poisoning, ultimately. So I don't think we need to spend any real time on that. I think by far the most common food reactions that we need to be aware of are food sensitivities. There are a little bit debated where there is a risk of a false positive, and is something that I have to admit I don't do much of in my clinic, but it is a common thing to consider. Then the intolerances we want to be thinking about, especially metabolic and pharmacologic intolerances. So these are the FODMAPs. This is lactose intolerance. This is histamine intolerance. These are incredibly common and are common causes of IBS type symptoms. If you want any further information on these, leave a comment. I'm more than happy to expand on each of these separately if there are people that would like me to do so. If you have liked this video, please give it a like, leave a comment, share it with a friend if they're struggling with gastrointestinal symptoms. But be mindful that certainly other symptoms that we can associate with adverse food reactions are brain fog, are fatigue, are sinus-based issues, are issues with our sleep. And really the list goes on. We can react to foods in lots of different ways, as we have seen, and we haven't even touched on all of them. And that reaction can manifest either in classic gut symptoms, but also in what we call extraintestinal symptoms, skin, cognition, mood, energy, among others. I hope this has been helpful. As I say, any questions, leave a comment below. I do try and get back to everyone's comments and questions. If you've had any experience going down any of these avenues, positive or negative, I would love you to share it. I think people really benefit and appreciate people's own journeys, and we can help one another by sharing our own journeys. I certainly have had issues with lactose, with histamine, with FODMAPs, with sulfites. So I've been there. I've pretty much come out the other ends. It was a long journey. It was a long process. There was a lot of back and forth amongst this, but it is very much possible. So I hope it's helpful. Questions, let me know. Please like, comment, share the video, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this sort of content, and I'll be back soon with another video. For now, stay healthy, enjoy your day, your week, and I'll speak to you all very soon.